James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. The alt-media purge is in full swing. We've got that story, plus the collapse of Western civilization. But first, it is raining on the weed parade. Trump names rabid cannabis prohibitionist as drug czar. This article via the Free Thought Project, in a move likely indicative of a coming resurgence in the long-running war on drugs. The Trump administration has appointed extreme marijuana prohibitionist Pennsylvania Representative Tom Marino to serve as U.S. drug czar. As drug czar, Marino would be responsible for coordinating drug control strategy and federal government funding of the drug war. Marino is known as a rabid hardliner on drug policy, going so far as to proclaim that nonviolent drug offenders should be placed in a hospital/prison. Congressman Marino is set to resign his position in the House to direct the Office of National Drug Policy Control, which advises President Trump on drug policy. So this is actually a two-parter. The second part of this story goes to a different department, with new DHS Secretary John Kelly saying marijuana is not a factor in the drug war. This via Fortune. Department of Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly said this past Sunday that marijuana is not a factor in the war on drugs, arguing that the biggest problems are found in other substances. Quote, marijuana is not a factor in the drug war, end quote. Kelly told NBC News' Chuck Todd on Meet the Press when asked how marijuana legalization would impede or help the drug war fight. So that was Sunday, but somehow by Tuesday the song remained the same. Homeland Security will continue to enforce marijuana laws via the Weed blog. DHS Secretary John Kelly says that the Department of Homeland Security will continue to enforce marijuana laws and make marijuana a major part of its criminal enforcement efforts. This has been the fear of many activists, industry professionals, consumers. As reported by the Washington Times, John Kelly is a retired Marine Corps general who, as commander of U.S. forces in Latin America, got a close-up look at the cartels that smuggled the drug into the U.S., said his department considers marijuana a dangerous drug both because it feeds the finances of the cartels and is harmful to users in the U.S. Quote, it is a potentially dangerous gateway drug that frequently leads to the use of harder drugs, the new secretary said in a speech laying out the top enforcement priorities he'll pursue. The Miami Herald also reported that Kelly stated, quote, let me be clear about marijuana. It is a potentially dangerous gateway drug that frequently leads to the use of harder drugs, he said in his first major speech before being sworn in. James, it's Trump and change. Just keep on trucking, right?
Pretty much. Absolutely. And let me add the Canadian perspective from this, because the other side of this is be careful what you wish for. You may wish for cannabis legalization, but the devil, as always, is in the details, as the Canadian people are about to find out, as legislation is just about to pass, or has just passed, about Canada's legalization. Anyway, it's going to pass. And, of course, Stan Dix of PressForTruth.ca has been doing some good work covering this and what it really means. I'll throw in a link to a conversation that he just had with Chad Jackett of the Cannabis Growers of Canada about legal cannabis in Canada and the way it is going to be implemented, which is, of course, not the way that most people would like it to be implemented. And some examples of some of the things that are going to come along with it, like it or not, are represented, for example, in a story from the good old CBC about roadside tests for pot need rethink before legalization, say defense lawyers, pointing out that the saliva tests that are used and will continue to be, or even more used in the era of legal cannabis, are imprecise. Imagine that. And oh, by the way, although they won't mention it, oh yeah, this is feeding into DNA databases and other things as well. So there's that side of it. And then there's stories like this one from the Toronto Sun. Pharmacy distributors want in on Canada's legalized marijuana regime. I bet they do, don't they? And then we also have this gem from Neil MacDonald, Norm MacDonald's brother, by the way, who is a CBC reporter. Canada will legalize pot after arresting a bunch of people for pot offenses first, which, again, sounds about right. So, as always, the devil is in the details, and when politicians are swept into office promising you things from on high, even when they do deliver, they don't necessarily deliver what you're wanting or expecting, and that's a good example of exactly this phenomenon. So once again, I will direct people over to Dan Dix, Press for Truth, where he's been doing work on this, and I'm sure we'll be continuing to keep an eye as it's expected to roll out in Canada in mid-2018. Legal cannabis, yay?
I wonder if the situation in Canada might mirror, I think, the really bad law that was recently passed in California. They might end up kind of paralleling each other. James, I've asked you this maybe off mic before. I don't know if I've asked you on air. How does this look from Japan? Because I know you've kind of said essentially anybody that's into smoking weed you're kind of a loser over there, right?
Well, at any rate, you're going to get arrested, and it's going to be, in some cases, national news. There was a story here just a few years ago. There was the university rugby team that got caught with, I don't know, a couple of joints or something, and it was literally national front page news. So it's a very, very, very different situation over here, and I'm not expecting legalization anytime in the near future. But hey, at least you're not executed for it here. I mean, it could be worse, like in some East Asian nations, I guess.
So as those jarheads like the ones running the Department of Homeland Security fear, what comes after weed immediately is, of course, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. The BBC looks at how Western civilization could collapse. From an article written by a freelance science journalist named Rachel Newer, she writes, the political economist Benjamin Friedman once compared modern Western society to a stable bicycle whose wheels are kept spinning by economic growth. Should that forward-propelling motion slow or cease, the pillars that define our society, democracy, individual liberty, social tolerance, and more, would begin to teeter. Our world would become an increasingly ugly place, one defined by a scramble over limited resources and a rejection of anyone outside our immediate group. Should we find no way to get the wheels back in motion, we'd eventually face total societal collapse. Such collapses have occurred many times in human history, and no civilization, no matter how seemingly great, is immune to the vulnerabilities that may lead a society to its end. Regardless of how well things are going in the present moment, the situation can always change. Putting aside species-ending events like asteroid strikes, nuclear winters, or deadly pandemics, history tells us that it's usually a plethora of factors that contribute to collapse. And this long article, How Western Civilization Could Collapse, then proceeds to go through basically all the hot spots, all the terrible situations all around the world. So, James, I just ask you, sort of, why now? Why this continued push? Is this just more kind of disaster porn for the age of rage?
Yes, well, that's one of the factors here, but this is really the perfect propaganda pill because it contains so much propaganda when you really drill into this this article, and they talk about the models that scientists have come up with about societal collapse, and if you plug in these numbers, then you find out that the ecological carrying capacity, which of course is always just coded euphemism for Malthusian nonsense about how we're all going to die in a generation or two. Trust us, this time we've only been wrong for the last 3 centuries. But an example, a specific example they give in the article, which really shows that I think tips the hand, is that Syria, what happened in Syria? Why is it falling apart now? And they talk about, this rapid population growth, and then there was this drought, and which of course was made worse by climate change. Don't ask for a citation on that, but anyway. And as a result, they careened towards societal collapse because of poor governance and blah, blah, blah. Oh, wait, sorry, what about the decade-plus long destabilization campaign that's been going on, that's been funded and openly acknowledged now by the U.S. and Western governments and other governments in the region, and all of the jihadi fighters that have been funded and flown in there? That might have had something to do with this quote-unquote civil war that you guys are all raging about? No. None of those geopolitical factors, none of that has any relevance. It's all about this, these models of ecological collapse and everything. Total BS. And I think that's just a symptom of all of the BS in the article. So it is disaster porn, that there's that aspect to it, but it's also more insidious than that, because of course they're trying to program the population to feel guilty for existing as usual. But on the flip side of this, I think there really are models of societal collapse and that sort of thing that are deep in the bowels of the Pentagon, the sentient world simulation and other things that I've talked about in the past that people may or may not know about. If you don't, please look it up, because it's important stuff. And yes, they do have models where they are, looking and testing all the variables and what happens if this happens. And I'm betting it's much more advanced than these kinds of rinky-dink silly models that they're plugging phony numbers into and talking about on the BBC. So I think it's it's a flip version of reality where they kind of push their propaganda campaign. And the long story short is, if you listen to their prescriptions, you're probably not going to head off the collapse of Western civilization. The only thing of interest, I thought, here was at the very end, they talk about some of the models for collapse. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a violent, clash of, end of the civilization kind of thing. It can be a fading away of civilization, a la the British Empire post-World War I. And I certainly have seen a lot of the geopolitical historical parallels with the World War I era. And I think that might actually be a potential for the ending of Pax Americana. Might be more of a fading away and replacing rather than a violent end. And in some ways, I guess we could hope for that. At least it would be better than blood on the streets and civil war, I guess.
James, unfortunately, that may be about as close as we get to good news on this episode 307 of New World Next Week for April 20th of 2017. But you make a fantastic point there among many. There's no citations whatsoever in this article. And it's even filed sort of under their future category. So it's sort of, they can couch it in the like, oh, golly, what if? So we don't have to actually provide any sources for all of this kind of threadaganda going out. Our third and final story on this New World Next Week episode. The alt media purge is in full swing. James, I don't really have any articles to cite here. I don't have any text to read. It's just something we've seen going on, and it's building and building and building. Milo, PewDiePie, Tomi Lahren. Yesterday it was Alex Jones. Today it was Bill Riley. Tomorrow, who knows? But the personality isn't really the point. As the saying goes, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. And I think the idea here is that the sort of inherently exploitative corporate media is eating itself alive. Normalizing cannibalism, if you will, and no one's really safe. We were chatting on my shows earlier today that there's a lot of different factors that may be kind of building this up, that maybe the dino media has less influence than a guy playing video games on Twitch. Is it a desperate move, as they know they are a dinosaur media, and that they'll start with the right because it's kind of obviously the easiest thing to attack and tear down? But will they turn on the left when they run out of people on the right to ruin? And they're maybe going after people in the alt media, and again, I kind of use these terms loosely, going after alt media in general. And a lot of it almost still seems like a kind of childish, like, that's for embarrassing us last fall. So there's lots of kind of spite going around. What do you see with this alt media purge?
Yeah, I think you're right about all of that. I mean, certainly the timing of all of this and it all coming in this big lump together does certainly raise certain questions, doesn't it? And look, I'm not on the right, alt-right or otherwise. I'm not on the left, progressive or otherwise. So I don't have a dog in that fight. I don't really care. It's just, it does seem that all of these right-wingy types of media organizations, specifically people, really, are being targeted all at the same time. Now, that's interesting. And, of course, ultimately, what is the lesson of this? I mean, look, I don't know each individual story, the ins and outs, and, who did what and who didn't do what and whatever. But I think the point of this is, if we're looking at people rather than ideas, then it's very easy to group everyone under some cult of personality of this person or that person, and then tear down the person. That is absolute basic information warfare 101. Just make sure everyone only concentrates on the person, and then you've got a big, easy, soft target to hit. Because, hey, everyone's a person, and everyone's got their faults, and everyone's going to be, you can drag anyone's name through the mud. And people, unfortunately, continue to fall for it. So, again, I've said it before many, many times. Let's reiterate it here. It's not about people. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's not about anyone else in this media space. It's about the information itself, what is independently verifiable. And whatever happens to any individual person, that information doesn't change based on that. And I think we have to be smarter than this. And that's why we shouldn't be falling into cults of personality in the first place. But I guess that's a larger societal point.
If I may, as I kind of often have been saying on my shows, art greater than artist. And I've been trying to think, as I often do, of a music analogy for this, at least in regards to the burning of AJ. James, you and I are both pretty well on the record. I can't speak for you exactly, but I know you, I think, as saying that Alex Jones was one of the biggest inspirations for doing what we do. We started blogs and podcasts over a decade ago. He said, you can do this too. You can do this yourself. Or it was kind of like I was hearing Jello Biafra say right around the same time, don't hate the media, become the media. So the best music analogy I can come up with is Kiss. As you get older, you see all the obvious flaws, but the influences can't be denied. You know, bands like Questlove, Slow, Nine Inch Nails, Bob Mould, they're all on record as loving Kiss. That doesn't mean they imitate them. I never picked up a bullhorn in my life. So I think in this case, it might be message greater than messenger.
That's a good analogy because Billy Corgan cites Kiss as a big influence. I hate Kiss. I can't stand them. But there you go. You never know. You don't know how the influence game works. But at any rate, that's a good analogy.
I will include, just like we include all our citations, everything we say and mention on these episodes will always be included in the show notes, like the entirely surprisingly long list of bands who all say they were heavily influenced by Kiss. We're heavily influenced by independent alternative media, and if you are excited and all this resonates with you, of course, we ask that you support our work. You can find, of course, all our Patreons and PayPals and subscriptions and all that stuff down in the show notes, and just link to our sites, because that's how we do this. James?
All right, we're going to leave it there for this week. Let's do it again next week, James. Thank you for 3 great stories.
All right, take care.